Throughout history, groups claiming to offer salvation, healing, or a better way of life have sometimes devolved into something far more sinister. Today, we're diving deep into three of the most shocking cults that have ever existed, each one more disturbing than the last. These aren't your typical religious movements gone wrong. These are organizations that left trails of broken lives, shattered families, and in some cases, actual corpses in their wake. The Ant Hill Kids tortured and mutilated their own members in the Canadian wilderness. The Millerites convinced thousands to abandon everything they owned for a prophecy that never came true. And Synanon transformed from a respected drug rehabilitation center into a violent criminal enterprise that literally tried to murder its critics with rattlesnakes. Yes, you heard that right. Rattlesnakes. What makes these groups particularly terrifying isn't just the violence or the manipulation. It's how they started with seemingly noble intentions, attracting normal, intelligent people who genuinely believed they were joining something positive. By the time these followers realized the truth, escape had become nearly impossible, and the consequences of trying to leave were often deadly. The stories you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about how people can be controlled, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed by charismatic leaders who wielded absolute power over their followers. These aren't just historical curiosities. Understanding how these groups operated reveals the dark psychology that continues to emerge in modern cults and extremist movements today. Let's begin with perhaps the most physically brutal cult in recorded history. Deep in the remote forests of Quebec and Ontario, a man who called himself Moses created a kingdom of unimaginable horror. His followers called themselves the Ant Hill Kids, and what happened within their isolated compounds defies belief. Roche Thériault was born in 1947 in rural Quebec, a bright child who excelled academically and developed an ego to match his intelligence. He taught himself English just to prove his intellectual superiority over his French-Canadian peers. This inflated sense of self would later fuel his belief that he was chosen by God to lead others to salvation. But Thériault's path to becoming one of Canada's most notorious criminals began not with violence, but with fear. Like many cult leaders, Thériault exploited his followers' anxiety about the end of the world. In 1977, he convinced a small group of people that the apocalypse was imminent and that only by following his guidance could they survive God's judgment. He proclaimed himself Moïse, the French version of Moses, and promised to lead his followers to safety in the wilderness, where they would live free from sin and prepare for the coming destruction of civilization. Initially, the group seemed like a typical back-to-the-land commune. Families sold their possessions, cut ties with relatives, and moved to remote locations where they could live off the grid. Thériault's early followers genuinely believed they were joining a spiritual movement that would save their souls. They had no idea they were walking into a nightmare that would last over a decade. The transformation from spiritual commune to torture chamber didn't happen overnight. Thériault gradually increased his control, implementing rules that isolated his followers from the outside world and from each other. Members couldn't speak to one another without his permission. He monitored every conversation, every relationship, every thought. Those who questioned his authority or showed signs of independent thinking were quickly identified and punished. But calling what happened next, punishment doesn't capture the true horror of what Theriot inflicted on his followers. These weren't disciplinary measures. They were acts of sadistic torture designed to break the human spirit completely. Theriot claimed that God spoke to him directly, revealing which followers were straying from the path and needed correction. In reality, he was using religious justification to satisfy his own twisted psychological needs. The punishments were creative in their cruelty. Followers were beaten with belts, hammers, and whatever other implements Theriot could find. He would suspend people from the ceiling for hours, leaving them hanging in agony. He forced them to pluck every hair from their bodies, one by one. Perhaps most degrading of all, he would make his followers eat human feces, sometimes their own, sometimes that of others, claiming it was necessary for their spiritual purification. Children born into the cult suffered even worse treatment. Theriot, who fathered 26 children with multiple women in the group, subjected these innocent victims to sexual abuse, physical torture, and psychological terror. He would nail children to trees, force them to stone each other, and hold them over open fires. One infant died during a botched circumcision that Theriot performed himself, despite having no medical training whatsoever. The escalation of violence reached its peak when Theriot began performing what he called surgeries on his followers. With no medical knowledge or proper equipment, he would cut open his victims and remove organs, claiming he was healing them under divine guidance. These procedures were nothing more than torture sessions that often resulted in death. In 1989, Solange Boillard complained of stomach pain. Instead of seeking medical help, Theriot decided to operate on her himself. He punched her in the stomach, performed an enema with olive oil, then cut her abdomen open with a knife and manually removed parts of her intestines. Boillard died the next day from the horrific procedure, her death serving as a wake-up call to some followers that their leader had completely lost touch with reality. But perhaps no one suffered more at Theriot's hands than Gabrielle Lavallée. Her story of survival and eventual escape would ultimately bring down the entire cult. Lavallée endured years of systematic torture that included repeated beatings, having a blowtorch applied to her genitals, the removal of 8 teeth, and a hypodermic needle deliberately broken off in her spine. When she attempted to escape but was forced to return, Theriot's revenge was swift and brutal. He nailed her hand to a table and then, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, amputated her arm. Lavallée somehow survived this mutilation and eventually found the courage to escape again. This time, she went directly to the authorities, and her testimony about life inside the Ant Hill Kids finally brought the full horror of Theriot's crimes to light. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the abuse. Police found evidence of torture, murder, and systematic brutalization of dozens of people, including children. Theriot was arrested in 1989 and initially sentenced to 12 years for aggravated assault against Lavallée. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of Solange Boillard and received a life sentence. The story of Roch Theriot ended in 2011 when he was murdered in prison by his cellmate, stabbed in the neck in an act of vigilante justice. But the trauma he inflicted on his followers continues to this day. Many survivors still struggle with physical disabilities, psychological trauma, and the challenge of rebuilding lives that were destroyed by their years in captivity. The Ant Hill Kids represent the absolute worst of what can happen when people surrender their autonomy to a charismatic leader who claims divine authority. Theriot's ability to convince intelligent, caring people to endure and even participate in acts of horrific violence demonstrates the terrifying power of psychological manipulation combined with isolation and fear. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how Theriot used religious language and concepts to justify his crimes. He convinced his followers that their suffering was necessary for salvation, that their pain was purifying their souls, and that questioning his authority was equivalent to rejecting God himself. This spiritual manipulation made it even more difficult for victims to recognize what was happening to them and to find the strength to escape. The legacy of the Ant Hill Kids serves as a stark reminder of the importance of maintaining connections to the outside world, questioning authority, and recognizing the warning signs of abusive leadership. No legitimate spiritual or therapeutic practice requires followers to endure physical torture, sexual abuse, or complete isolation from friends and family. When leaders claim exclusive access to truth or salvation, when they demand absolute obedience and punish independent thinking, these are red flags that should never be ignored. The survivors of Theriot's cult have shown remarkable courage in rebuilding their lives and sharing their stories. Their testimonies serve as a warning to others and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Now let's dive deeper into the horrifying world of the Millerites, a religious movement that proves cults don't always need physical violence to destroy lives. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is false hope itself. Picture this. It's 1844, and across America, thousands of people are selling everything they own, abandoning their farms, and preparing to meet Jesus Christ in the clouds. Children are pulled from school, marriages are abandoned, and entire communities are gripped by an apocalyptic fever that would end in one of the most psychologically devastating events in American religious history. The man behind this mass delusion was William Miller, a prosperous farmer from New York who seemed like the last person you'd expect to start a doomsday cult. Born in 1782, Miller was initially a skeptic of organized religion, even considering himself a deist for a time. But after serving in the War of 1812 and experiencing what he believed were divine revelations, Miller became obsessed with biblical prophecy. He spent years poring over scripture, convinced he could calculate the exact date of Christ's return using mathematical formulas derived from the book of Daniel. Miller's calculations led him to a conclusion. The world would end sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. But this wasn't just some obscure farmer's wild theory. Miller's message spread like wildfire across the northeastern United States, attracting followers from established Protestant denominations who were already anxious about the rapid social changes of the industrial age. What made Miller's prophecy so seductive was its apparent scholarly foundation. This wasn't some wild-eyed preacher ranting about the end times. Miller presented charts, mathematical calculations, and detailed biblical interpretations that seemed to prove his point beyond doubt. He claimed that the 2,300-day prophecy in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, when properly understood, pointed to the cleansing of the earth by fire in 1844. To desperate people seeking meaning in an uncertain world, Miller's confident predictions offered both terror and hope. The movement exploded in popularity thanks to Joshua Himes, a Boston minister who became Miller's most effective promoter. Himes established newspapers, organized massive tent revivals, and turned Miller's local preaching into a national phenomenon. The most famous of these publications, Signs of the Times, reached thousands of readers, with increasingly urgent warnings about the approaching apocalypse. As the predicted date approached, Millerite behavior became increasingly extreme and disturbing. Families sold their homes and businesses, convinced they wouldn't need earthly possessions in heaven. Farmers stopped planting crops, reasoning that there would be no harvest. Some followers gave away all their money to the poor or to support Miller's ministry. Children were kept home from school because education seemed pointless when the world was about to end. The psychological pressure on Millerite families was immense. Imagine being a child in a household where your parents constantly spoke about the approaching destruction of everyone and everything you knew. Many followers experienced what we would now recognize as severe anxiety and depression, but in their religious framework, these feelings were interpreted as spiritual preparation for the coming judgment. When March 21st, 1844 passed without incident, there was disappointment, but the movement didn't collapse immediately. Miller's followers rationalized the failure, suggesting there might have been a miscalculation or that God was showing mercy by delaying judgment. This is a classic pattern in failed prophecy movements. Rather than admitting error, believers often double down on their faith and find new explanations. Enter Samuel Snow, a Millerite preacher who claimed to have discovered Miller's error. Using different calculations based on the Jewish calendar, Snow proclaimed that the true date of Christ's return would be October 22nd, 1844. This became known as the Midnight Cry, referencing the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew's Gospel. The announcement reinvigorated the movement with even greater intensity than before. The weeks leading up to October 22nd, 1844, witnessed scenes that bordered on mass hysteria. Millerites gathered in churches and on hilltops, many wearing white ascension robes specially made for their anticipated flight to heaven. Some climbed trees or stood on rooftops, believing they needed to be closer to the sky when Jesus appeared. Others spent the night in graveyards, expecting to witness the resurrection of the dead. Children were kept awake all night, dressed in their finest clothes, while adults sang hymns and prayed with desperate fervor. Some followers had given away their winter clothing, certain they wouldn't need it in heaven. Others had slaughtered their livestock and consumed their food stores, believing earthly sustenance would soon be unnecessary. But October 22nd came and went like any other day. The sun rose, the world continued spinning, and Jesus Christ did not appear in the clouds. What followed became known as the Great Disappointment, a psychological catastrophe that shattered the lives of tens of thousands of believers. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Some suffered complete mental breakdowns, unable to reconcile their absolute faith with the undeniable reality of failed prophecy. Others became suicidal, having invested everything, their money, their relationships, their entire sense of purpose in Miller's predictions. The social consequences were equally brutal. Millerites who had given away their possessions found themselves destitute as winter approached. Those who had abandoned their farms discovered their fields overgrown with weeds and their livestock dead or sold. Families were torn apart as some members lost faith while others desperately clung to modified versions of Miller's teachings. The broader community showed little sympathy for the disappointed Millerites. Newspapers mocked them mercilessly, publishing cartoons and satirical articles about the foolish fanatics who had believed the world would end. Former neighbors who had been alienated by the Millerites' previous claims of superior spiritual knowledge now felt justified in their ridicule. Violence against Millerites wasn't uncommon in the weeks following the Great Disappointment. Mobs attacked Millerite gatherings with clubs and stones. Some believers were tarred and feathered, while others had their homes vandalized or burned. The movement that had once attracted thousands of respectable church members was now associated with delusion and social disruption. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Millerite tragedy was how it destroyed people's ability to trust their own judgment. These weren't gullible or uneducated people. Many Millerites were successful farmers, merchants, and professionals who had been convinced by what seemed like solid biblical scholarship. The failure of Miller's prophecy left them questioning not just their religious beliefs, but their capacity to make rational decisions about anything. Some former Millerites never recovered from the psychological trauma. They withdrew from society, unable to engage with a world that had proven so different from their expectations. Others swung to the opposite extreme, rejecting all religious faith and becoming bitter atheists. The movement's failure created a generation of people who had experienced the ultimate betrayal, not just by a human leader, but by their understanding of God himself. Yet incredibly, not all Millerites abandoned their apocalyptic beliefs. A significant number of followers refused to accept that Miller had been completely wrong, instead developing new interpretations of what had happened on October 22nd, 1844. This is where the story becomes even more disturbing, because it shows how failed prophecy can actually strengthen certain believers' commitment rather than breaking it. The most successful reinterpretation came from a small group led by Hiram Edson, who claimed to have received a vision explaining the Great Disappointment. According to Edson, Miller hadn't been wrong about the date. He had simply misunderstood what would happen. Instead of Christ returning to earth, October 22nd, 1844, marked the beginning of Christ's final work in a heavenly sanctuary, preparing for his eventual second coming. This doctrine became the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which continues to exist today with millions of members worldwide. While modern Adventists don't set specific dates for Christ's return, they maintain that his second coming is imminent and that October 22nd, 1844 was indeed a prophetically significant date. The psychological mechanism at work here is called cognitive dissonance reduction. When people have invested heavily in a belief system and that system fails, it's often easier to modify the belief than to abandon it entirely. This adaptation allowed them to maintain their sense of being specially chosen by God while explaining away the obvious failure of Miller's original prophecy. It's a pattern we see repeatedly in cult movements. Failed predictions don't necessarily destroy the group. They often just lead to more complex and unfalsifiable belief systems. The Millerite movement reveals how religious extremism can be deadly even without physical violence. The death here was psychological and social, the destruction of thousands of lives through false hope and misplaced trust. People lost their homes, their families, their mental health, and their place in society, all because they believed in a charismatic leader's interpretation of ancient prophecies. What makes the Millerite story particularly chilling is how normal and reasonable William Miller seemed compared to leaders like Roche Thériault or Chuck Dedrick. Miller wasn't obviously deranged or power-hungry. He appeared to be a sincere, scholarly man who genuinely believed his calculations were correct. This makes his movement more dangerous in some ways, because it shows how even well-intentioned religious leadership can cause massive harm when combined with absolute certainty and end times thinking. The Great Disappointment also demonstrates the social conditions that make cult movements possible. The Millerites emerged during a period of rapid social change, economic uncertainty, and religious revival in American history. People were already anxious about the future, making them susceptible to messages that promised both explanation and escape from their troubles. Modern scholars recognize the Millerite movement as a case study in the psychology of failed prophecy and social influence. It shows how mathematical complexity and apparent scholarship can make even absurd claims seem credible to desperate people. It reveals how social proof, seeing others believe, can override individual critical thinking, and it demonstrates how the sunk cost fallacy keeps people committed to obviously false beliefs long after rational evaluation would suggest abandonment. The legacy of the Millerites extends far beyond the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Their movement influenced numerous other apocalyptic groups and established patterns of prophetic failure and reinterpretation that continue today. Every time we see a religious leader predicting the end of the world, we're witnessing an echo of William Miller's tragic miscalculation. Perhaps most importantly, the Millerite story reminds us that cult victims aren't necessarily weak, stupid, or gullible people. They're often sincere individuals seeking meaning and hope in uncertain times, making them vulnerable to confident leaders who claim to have special knowledge about the future. Moving deeper into the disturbing world of Synanon, we begin to see how an organization that once represented hope for thousands of addicts became a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power. What makes Synanon particularly chilling is how systematically it evolved from legitimate therapy into calculated terrorism, all while maintaining the facade of a revolutionary treatment program. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Chuck Dedrick's descent into paranoid authoritarianism was gradual but relentless. By the mid-1970s, he had begun instituting what he called lifestyle changes that grew increasingly bizarre and controlling. Members were required to shave their heads, creating a uniformed appearance that stripped away individual identity. Personal relationships were forbidden unless approved by Dedrick himself, and he began recording private conversations between members, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and mistrust. Perhaps most disturbing was Dedrick's manipulation of basic human needs and desires. Food became a tool of control, with certain meals designated as rewards for compliance and others as punishment for perceived infractions. Sleep deprivation was routine, with members subjected to marathon sessions of the game that could last 12 to 15 hours without breaks. These sessions weren't just verbal confrontations anymore. They had evolved into psychological torture designed to break down individual will and create complete dependency on the organization. The financial exploitation was equally systematic. New members were required to turn over all their assets to Synanon, including homes, cars, bank accounts, and even custody of their children. Wealthy members were particularly targeted, with Dederick personally overseeing their integration to ensure maximum financial contribution. The organization amassed a fleet of luxury cars, including Rolls-Royces and Ferraris, while members lived in cramped, often unsanitary conditions. This stark contrast between leadership luxury and member deprivation became a hallmark of Synanon's later years. What made Synanon especially dangerous was its sophisticated public relations machine. Even as violence escalated internally, the organization maintained powerful allies in government, media, and academia. Prominent politicians visited Synanon facilities and praised their work. Major newspapers ran favorable stories about their innovative approach to addiction treatment. Universities sent students to study their methods. This external validation made it incredibly difficult for victims to be believed when they finally escaped and tried to tell their stories. The Imperial Marines represent the culmination of Synanon's transformation into a paramilitary organization. These weren't just security guards, they were true believers who had been systematically desensitized to violence through years of increasingly aggressive games and indoctrination. They wore military-style uniforms, carried weapons, and were trained in combat techniques. Their primary mission was to prevent defections and punish anyone who threatened Synanon's operations, whether from within or outside the organization. The stories of individual victims reveal the true horror of life inside Synanon during its violent phase. Children born into the community were separated from their parents and raised collectively, subjected to the same brutal games as adults despite their young age. Teenagers who questioned authority were beaten unconscious and locked in isolation cells for weeks at a time. Women who resisted Dederick's sexual advances faced public humiliation and physical punishment. Men who showed reluctance to participate in violence were themselves targeted for brutal assault. One of the most chilling aspects of Synanon's operation was how it used legitimate therapeutic language to justify abuse. This manipulation of language made it difficult for victims to even conceptualize what was happening to them as abuse, creating a form of psychological imprisonment that was often more effective than physical restraints. The rattlesnake incident that ultimately brought down Dederick wasn't an isolated act of violence, but rather the culmination of an escalating campaign of terrorism against anyone who challenged Synanon. Former members reported being followed by cars, receiving threatening phone calls, and finding their homes vandalized. Business owners who refused to work with Synanon faced boycotts and intimidation. Journalists who investigated the organization received death threats. The placement of a venomous snake in Paul Morance's mailbox was simply the most dramatic example of tactics that had been employed for years. The aftermath of Synanon's collapse reveals another layer of its devastating impact. Many former members struggled for decades to readjust to life outside the organization. Having surrendered their autonomy for years or even decades, they found themselves unable to make basic decisions about their daily lives. The psychological trauma was compounded by practical challenges. Many had no job skills, no credit history, and no family relationships to fall back on. Support groups for Synanon survivors continue to meet today, more than 30 years after the organization's dissolution. The influence of Synanon's methods extended far beyond its own membership, creating a legacy of harm that persists in various forms of tough love treatment programs. The Synanon model was copied by hundreds of residential treatment facilities, many of which continued to employ confrontational therapy, forced labor, and physical punishment long after these methods had been discredited. The troubled teen industry, which subjects thousands of adolescents to abusive treatment each year, can trace many of its practices directly back to Synanon's innovations in institutional control. What makes these three organizations particularly instructive is how they represent different pathways to the same destination: the complete subordination of individual human dignity to the will of charismatic leaders. The Ant Hill Kids showed how religious extremism could justify the most horrific physical abuse. The Millerites demonstrated how apocalyptic prophecy could devastate entire communities psychologically and economically. Synanon revealed how therapeutic language and social respectability could mask systematic exploitation and violence. Each of these groups exploited fundamental human vulnerabilities in their recruitment and control strategies. They offered simple solutions to complex problems, whether spiritual salvation, certainty about the future, or recovery from addiction. They provided a sense of belonging and purpose to individuals who felt isolated or lost in mainstream society. They promised transformation and transcendence to people struggling with ordinary human limitations and disappointments. The leaders of these organizations shared certain characteristics that seem to emerge repeatedly in cult dynamics. They possessed exceptional charisma and communication skills that allowed them to attract and influence large numbers of followers. They demonstrated a willingness to escalate their demands gradually, beginning with reasonable requests and slowly increasing their control until followers found themselves trapped in situations they never would have accepted initially. They showed a remarkable ability to reframe their own failures and abuses as evidence of their followers' inadequacy or lack of faith. Understanding these patterns is crucial because they continue to manifest in various forms today. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Roche-Thériault to torture his followers, William Miller to convince thousands to abandon their livelihoods, and Chuck Dederick to transform a treatment program into a terrorist organization are still operating in contemporary society. They appear in political movements that demand absolute loyalty, in online communities that isolate members from outside perspectives, and in therapeutic programs that claim to offer revolutionary solutions to human problems. The digital age has created new opportunities for these dynamics to flourish. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that reinforce extreme beliefs. Online communities can provide the same sense of belonging and purpose that physical cults once offered. Charismatic leaders can reach and influence vast numbers of people without ever meeting them in person. The speed and scale of modern communication mean that harmful ideologies can spread faster and further than ever before. The stories of survivors from these organizations also reveal the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite experiencing years or decades of abuse, manipulation, and trauma, many former members of these groups have gone on to rebuild their lives, form healthy relationships, and contribute positively to their communities. Their courage in speaking out about their experiences has been instrumental in exposing the dangers of cultic organizations and helping others avoid similar fates. These cases remind us that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within human nature and human societies. The same social bonds that can be exploited by manipulative leaders are also the source of genuine community, support, and healing. The same desire for meaning and purpose that makes people vulnerable to extremist ideologies can also motivate acts of compassion, creativity, and positive social change. What makes these stories particularly chilling isn't just the violence or manipulation, but how each group exploited fundamental human needs: the need for belonging, for purpose, for healing, for salvation. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but systematic campaigns that revealed something disturbing about human psychology and our capacity for both devotion and destruction. The psychological mechanisms at work in these cults follow disturbingly predictable patterns. First comes the isolation. Theriot moved his followers to remote locations in the Canadian wilderness, cutting them off from family and friends. The Millerites were encouraged to separate themselves from mainstream society, preparing for an apocalypse that would distinguish them from the unworthy masses. Synanon members were pressured to live within the community, breaking ties with the outside world. This isolation serves a dual purpose. It eliminates outside perspectives that might challenge the leader's authority, and it creates a dependency where the cult becomes the members' entire social reality. Next comes the gradual escalation of control. None of these groups started with their most extreme practices. Theriot didn't begin by forcing followers to break their own legs with sledgehammers. He started with motivational speeches and promises of spiritual freedom. The escalation was methodical, each boundary crossed, making the next violation seem less shocking. Psychologists call this the foot in the door technique, where small commitments lead to larger ones. By the time followers realized the true nature of what they'd joined, they were already deeply psychologically invested and often physically trapped. The language these groups used is particularly revealing. Theriot called himself Moses and claimed divine communication. Dederick reframed his organization as a religion when legal pressure mounted. Miller presented his calculations as biblical truth rather than personal interpretation. This manipulation of language serves to elevate the leader's authority beyond human criticism. When someone claims to speak for God, questioning them becomes not just disobedience, but blasphemy. The financial exploitation common to all three groups demonstrates how these organizations systematically strip away members' ability to leave. Millerites sold their possessions in preparation for the end times. Synanon accumulated millions through member contributions and labor. Theriot's followers abandoned their livelihoods to follow him into the wilderness. Economic dependency becomes another chain binding people to the group, making escape seem impossible even when abuse becomes undeniable. What's particularly tragic is how these groups perverted genuine human needs. The desire for spiritual meaning, for community, for overcoming addiction, for understanding life's purpose. These are healthy human impulses. But charismatic leaders learned to weaponize these needs, turning them into tools of control and exploitation. The very vulnerabilities that make us human become the entry points for manipulation. The role of enablers and bystanders in these stories cannot be ignored. Thériault's abuse continued for years in communities where neighbors must have suspected something was wrong. Synanon operated openly in California, praised by many even as reports of abuse surfaced. The Millerites faced ridicule after their prophecy failed, but the underlying dynamics that made their movement possible remained largely unexamined. Society's failure to recognize and respond to these warning signs allowed the abuse to continue and escalate. The psychological aftermath for survivors reveals the true depth of these groups' destructiveness. Gabrielle Lavallee, who escaped Thériault's commune, didn't just suffer physical injuries that would affect her for life. She, like many cult survivors, faced the challenge of rebuilding her entire sense of identity and reality. When someone has been told for years that their leader is infallible, that questioning is sinful, that the outside world is evil or doomed, reintegrating into normal society becomes an enormous psychological challenge. The children born into or raised within these groups face particular trauma. Thériault's 26 children witnessed and experienced horrific abuse that shaped their understanding of normal human relationships. These intergenerational effects mean that the damage done by cults extends far beyond the original members, affecting families for decades. Many children of cult members struggle with trust, authority, and forming healthy relationships long after escaping or being rescued. The evolution of these groups over time shows how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Deadliest's transformation from a recovering alcoholic trying to help others into a paranoid dictator ordering violent attacks illustrates how unchecked authority inevitably leads to abuse. The absence of external oversight, internal checks and balances, or democratic decision-making creates conditions where leaders can indulge their worst impulses without consequence. These stories also reveal how societal factors contribute to cult formation and persistence. Economic uncertainty, social upheaval, and spiritual seeking create conditions where authoritarian movements can flourish. The Millerites emerged during a period of rapid social change in 19th century America. Synanon gained traction during the counterculture movement of the 1960s when many people were questioning traditional institutions. Thériault's commune attracted followers during the 1970s, another era of social and economic turbulence. The modern relevance of these historical cases cannot be overstated. While the specific forms may have changed, the underlying dynamics of manipulation, control, and exploitation continue to manifest in various contexts today. Online communities, multi-level marketing schemes, political movements, and even some corporate cultures can exhibit cult-like characteristics. Understanding these historical examples provides crucial tools for recognizing and resisting such manipulation in contemporary forms. The intersection of mental health and cult involvement adds another layer of complexity to these stories. Many cult leaders exhibit clear signs of personality disorders, particularly narcissistic and antisocial traits. Deadliest's alcoholism and paranoia, Thériault's grandiose delusions, and Miller's obsessive calculations all suggest underlying psychological issues that, when combined with charismatic abilities and unchecked power, created devastating consequences. However, it's crucial to understand that cult members themselves are not inherently mentally ill or weak. Research shows that anyone can become vulnerable to cult recruitment under the right circumstances, particularly during times of personal crisis, transition, or seeking. The failure of institutions to protect vulnerable individuals emerges as a recurring theme across all three cases. Law enforcement, social services, and religious authorities often failed to recognize or respond adequately to the warning signs of abuse. This institutional failure highlights the need for better training, clearer protocols, and more proactive approaches to identifying and intervening in potentially dangerous group dynamics. Recovery from cult involvement is a complex process that can take years or even decades. Survivors often describe feeling like they need to rebuild their entire sense of self, learning to trust their own judgment after years of being told their thoughts and feelings were wrong or sinful. The shame and stigma associated with cult involvement can make it difficult for survivors to seek help or share their experiences, further complicating their recovery process. The legal challenges in prosecuting cult leaders and holding these organizations accountable reveal gaps in our justice system's ability to address complex psychological and spiritual abuse. While physical violence can be prosecuted, the psychological manipulation and spiritual abuse that often cause the deepest harm are much harder to address through legal means. The protection of religious freedom, while important, can sometimes be exploited by abusive groups to shield themselves from accountability. These three cases demonstrate that the term deadly cult encompasses various forms of harm extending far beyond physical violence. The Anthill Kids represent the most direct form of physical brutality, but the psychological devastation experienced by the Millerites and the systematic violence of Synanon were equally destructive in their own ways. Understanding this broader definition of harm is crucial for recognizing and addressing cult-like abuse in all its forms. The resilience of survivors stands as perhaps the most inspiring aspect of these dark stories. Despite experiencing unimaginable trauma, many survivors have not only rebuilt their lives, but have become advocates for others, sharing their stories to prevent future victims and working to educate society about the dangers of cult involvement. The psychological mechanisms that made these three cults so devastatingly effective reveal disturbing patterns about human vulnerability and the seductive nature of extremist ideologies. What makes these groups particularly chilling is how they exploited fundamental human needs, the desire for belonging, purpose, and salvation, and weaponized them against their own followers. Understanding these manipulation tactics becomes crucial not just for historical context, but for recognizing similar patterns that continue to emerge in modern society. The recruitment phase across all three groups followed remarkably similar blueprints. Thériault's Anthill Kids initially attracted followers through promises of spiritual purity and salvation from an impending apocalypse. He positioned himself as the enlightened leader who alone possessed the knowledge to guide his followers to safety. The Millerites drew adherents through Miller's scholarly approach to biblical prophecy, offering concrete dates and mathematical calculations that gave believers a sense of certainty about their spiritual future. Synanon's recruitment was perhaps the most insidious because it genuinely helped people initially, drug addicts found real recovery through the program's methods, creating a foundation of gratitude and trust that Dedrick later exploited ruthlessly. The isolation tactics employed by these groups were systematic and deliberate. Thériault physically removed his followers from society, taking them to remote locations in the Canadian wilderness where external contact became impossible. This geographical isolation was coupled with psychological barriers. Members were forbidden from communicating with each other without his presence, creating an environment where he controlled all information flow. The Millerites achieved isolation through ideological separation, convincing followers that the outside world was corrupt and doomed, making believers feel special and chosen while simultaneously cutting them off from dissenting voices. Synanon's isolation was more subtle but equally effective. The live-in treatment center format created a closed community where members became financially and emotionally dependent on the organization, making departure seem impossible. The escalation of control in each group followed predictable patterns that reveal how normal people can gradually accept increasingly extreme conditions. Thériault began with relatively mild rules and spiritual exercises before slowly introducing more severe punishments and bizarre requirements. This gradual escalation meant that followers never faced a single moment where they could clearly recognize the line between acceptable and unacceptable treatment. Each step seemed only slightly worse than the last. The Millerites experienced escalation through increasing fervor and sacrifice, with members encouraged to give up more and more of their worldly possessions and connections as the prophesied date approached. Synanon's escalation was particularly insidious because it was framed as therapeutic progress. More aggressive confrontation in the game was presented as deeper healing, while increasing control over members' lives was described as necessary for their recovery. The role of language manipulation cannot be understated in understanding how these groups maintained control. Thériault used religious terminology to justify horrific abuse, claiming divine revelation and positioning his violence as necessary spiritual purification. His followers were conditioned to interpret their suffering as proof of their spiritual advancement, creating a psychological framework where pain became evidence of progress. The Millerites developed their own vocabulary around prophecy and spiritual preparation that reinforced their beliefs and made questioning seem like a betrayal of faith. Synanon's language system was perhaps the most sophisticated, with specialized terminology that redefined normal human emotions and relationships in ways that served the organization's purposes. The financial exploitation in each group revealed how economic dependence became another tool of control. Thériault's followers gave up their possessions and relied entirely on the commune for survival, making departure seem economically impossible. Many Millerites sold their homes and businesses in preparation for the end times, leaving them financially devastated when the prophecies failed. Synanon accumulated massive wealth through a combination of member donations, business ventures, and the free labor of its residents, creating a powerful economic engine that funded the organization's expansion and Dedrick's increasingly lavish lifestyle. The psychological aftermath experienced by survivors of these groups demonstrates the profound and lasting damage inflicted by cult involvement. Gabrielle Lavallee, who survived Thériault's torture, including the amputation of her arm, required years of therapy to process her trauma and rebuild her sense of self-worth. Many Millerites never fully recovered from the great disappointment, experiencing what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some lost their faith entirely, while others spent decades trying to reconcile their experience with their spiritual beliefs. Synanon survivors often struggled with the complex reality that the organization had genuinely helped them overcome addiction while simultaneously subjecting them to psychological and physical abuse. The broader social impact of these groups extended far beyond their immediate membership. The Ant Hill Kids case led to significant changes in how Canadian authorities monitor isolated religious communities and respond to reports of abuse. The Millerite movement fundamentally altered American religious landscape, contributing to the rise of several denominations while also creating lasting skepticism about prophetic movements. Synanon's influence on the addiction treatment industry was particularly problematic, as its confrontational methods were adopted by numerous programs that continued using these techniques long after Synanon's abusive nature became public knowledge. Modern parallels to these historical cults can be found in various contemporary movements and organizations. Online communities have created new possibilities for ideological isolation and manipulation, with algorithms that create echo chambers similar to the information control exercised by cult leaders. The rise of conspiracy theories and extremist political movements often employs similar tactics of gradual escalation and language manipulation. Even legitimate therapeutic and self-help movements sometimes adopt concerning elements reminiscent of Synanon's model, using confrontational techniques and creating dependency relationships that can be exploitative. The warning signs that emerge from studying these three groups provide crucial insights for identifying potentially dangerous organizations. Excessive veneration of a single leader demands for total commitment and isolation from outside relationships, financial exploitation, and the gradual normalization of extreme behavior all serve as red flags. The presence of an us versus them mentality, claims of special knowledge or divine revelation, and the suppression of questions or dissent should raise immediate concerns about any group or movement. Understanding these patterns becomes particularly important in our current era of social media and digital connectivity, where new forms of manipulation and control are constantly emerging. The basic human vulnerabilities exploited by Theriot, Miller, and Dederick remain unchanged, but the methods for exploiting them continue to evolve. The patterns we've uncovered in examining the Ant Hill Kids, the Millerites, and Synanon reveal disturbing truths about human vulnerability and the systematic exploitation of our deepest needs. These three groups, despite their vastly different origins and methods, demonstrate how ordinary people can become trapped in extraordinary circumstances of control and manipulation. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how they each began with legitimate human desires. The Ant Hill Kids promised spiritual salvation and community in an uncertain world. The Millerites offered hope and meaning during a time of social upheaval. Synanon provided genuine recovery and healing for those struggling with addiction. Yet each descended into darkness through remarkably similar mechanisms of control that we must understand to protect ourselves and others. The first, and perhaps most crucial pattern, is the gradual escalation of control. None of these groups immediately revealed their true nature. Roche-Thériault didn't start by nailing children to trees or performing deadly surgeries. He began with motivational speeches and promises of unity. William Miller didn't initially demand followers sell all their possessions. He started with biblical study groups and prophecy discussions. Chuck Dederick didn't launch Synanon with rattlesnake attacks and forced sterilizations. He began with innovative addiction recovery methods that actually worked. This incremental approach is terrifyingly effective because it allows followers to become psychologically invested before recognizing the danger. Each small compromise makes the next one easier to accept. When someone has already given up their job to join a community, giving up contact with family seems like a smaller step. When someone has already accepted verbal abuse as therapy, physical abuse can be rationalized as necessary for growth. This is how normal people with functioning moral compasses can find themselves participating in or tolerating horrific acts. The manipulation of language represents another crucial control mechanism across all three groups. Thériault reframed brutal torture as divine punishment or necessary discipline. The Millerites transformed economic ruin and social humiliation into tests of faith. Synanon disguised psychological abuse as therapeutic breakthrough and violent retaliation as community protection. By controlling the vocabulary used to describe experiences, these leaders literally shaped how followers understood reality. When victims couldn't name what was happening to them accurately, they couldn't recognize it as abuse or seek appropriate help. Children in the Anthill Kids couldn't articulate that being nailed to trees was torture when it was presented as religious correction. Millerites couldn't see financial irresponsibility when it was framed as faithful preparation. Synanon members couldn't identify brainwashing when it was called personal growth. This linguistic manipulation creates a kind of psychological prison where the bars are made of twisted words and redefined concepts. Social isolation emerges as perhaps the most effective tool of control employed by all three groups. The Anthill Kids were physically removed to remote locations where escape was difficult and outside contact impossible. The Millerites were encouraged to separate themselves from non-believers, creating an echo chamber of shared delusion. Synanon members were cut off from family and friends who might question the organization's increasingly extreme demands. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It eliminates alternative perspectives that might challenge the group's narrative. It creates complete dependency on the organization for social connection and validation. It makes leaving seem impossible because followers have no support network outside the group. Perhaps most insidiously, it allows leaders to claim that outside criticism proves the group's special status, that persecution demonstrates they're doing something right. The exploitation of legitimate human needs makes these groups particularly insidious. Every person requires purpose, belonging, and meaning in their lives. We all seek healing from trauma, answers to existential questions, and connection with others who share our struggles. These are not weaknesses to be ashamed of, but fundamental aspects of human nature. The leaders of these groups understood this intuitively. They offered purpose to those feeling directionless, belonging to the isolated, healing to the wounded, and certainty to those overwhelmed by life's complexities. The tragedy is that these offers weren't entirely false initially. Many Synanon members did overcome addiction. Some Millerites found genuine spiritual community. Even Ant Hill Kids members experienced moments of connection and meaning before the horror fully emerged. This is why it's crucial to understand that cult membership isn't a sign of stupidity or moral failing. Intelligent, caring people join these groups because they offer something genuinely needed. The manipulation comes in how these legitimate needs are gradually weaponized against the followers themselves. Financial dependency creates another layer of control that makes escape extremely difficult. The Millerites who sold their farms and businesses found themselves with no means of supporting themselves when the prophecies failed. Synanon members who donated their assets to the organization had nowhere to go when they recognized its true nature. Ant Hill Kids followers who abandoned their careers and homes became completely dependent on Thériault's commune for survival. This economic entrapment is particularly cruel because it transforms the very act of commitment into a chain that binds followers to the group. The more someone sacrifices to join, the harder it becomes to leave, creating a psychological trap where past investment justifies continued participation even when conditions become intolerable. The role of societal indifference or complicity cannot be ignored in examining how these groups operated for so long. The Ant Hill Kids brutalized children and murdered members in relative isolation while authorities failed to investigate reports of abuse. The Millerites faced mockery rather than support when their prophecies failed, driving many deeper into extremism rather than helping them reintegrate into society. Synanon's violence was often dismissed or minimized because of its reputation for helping addicts. This societal failure highlights how communities can inadvertently enable cult activity through willful blindness, misplaced respect for religious freedom, or simple indifference to others' suffering. When neighbors don't want to get involved, when authorities dismiss reports as family disputes, when society stigmatizes victims rather than supporting them, dangerous groups are allowed to operate with impunity. The lasting trauma experienced by survivors reveals the true cost of these groups' activities. Gabrielle Lavallee lived with permanent physical disabilities and psychological scars from her time with the Ant Hill Kids. Former Millerites struggled with shattered faith and financial ruin that affected their families for generations. Synanon survivors dealt with broken family relationships and difficulty trusting others after years of manipulation and abuse. Yet the resilience of these survivors also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human beings to heal and rebuild their lives even after experiencing extreme trauma. Many have courageously shared their stories to warn others and help society understand how these groups operate. Their willingness to relive painful experiences for the greater good represents a profound act of service that deserves our deepest respect and gratitude. Understanding these patterns isn't just an academic exercise. Similar dynamics continue to play out in various forms today, from online conspiracy communities that isolate members from dissenting voices to wellness groups that gradually escalate financial and personal demands to political movements that demonize outsiders while demanding absolute loyalty from followers. The fundamental human needs that made people vulnerable to the Ant Hill Kids, the Millerites, and Synanon haven't disappeared. If anything, modern society's increasing isolation, economic uncertainty, and loss of traditional community structures may make people even more susceptible to groups that promise easy answers and instant belonging. Recognizing these warning signs in ourselves and others remains crucial. When any group demands increasing isolation from family and friends, when questions are discouraged rather than welcomed, when financial sacrifice is required to prove commitment, when language is used to obscure rather than clarify, when criticism is automatically dismissed as persecution, these are red flags that deserve serious attention. The stories of the Ant Hill Kids, the Millerites, and Synanon ultimately serve as both warning and testament. They warn us about the depths of cruelty that can emerge when power goes unchecked and vulnerable people are systematically exploited. The devastating legacies of the Ant Hill Kids, Millerites, and Synanon extend far beyond their immediate victims, serving as stark reminders of how quickly human hopes and vulnerabilities can be weaponized by those seeking absolute control. Each of these groups demonstrates the insidious nature of cult manipulation, showing how promises of salvation, belonging, or healing can mask the most horrific forms of exploitation and abuse. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how they reveal the systematic destruction of individual agency through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Roche Thériault didn't begin his reign of terror with surgical mutilations and forced cannibalism. He started with promises of spiritual salvation and protection from an apocalyptic world, gradually escalating his control until his followers found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which escape seemed impossible. The progression was methodical, each boundary crossed, making the next violation seem almost inevitable. By the time members realized the true nature of their situation, they had been so thoroughly broken down that resistance felt futile. The Millerite movement demonstrates how even well-intentioned religious fervor can cause widespread devastation when combined with absolute certainty about divine revelation. William Miller genuinely believed in his prophetic calculations, and his followers weren't victims of deliberate deception in the traditional sense. Yet the Great Disappointment of 1844 destroyed thousands of lives just as effectively as any violent cult leader. Families lost their homes, their savings, their social standing, and their faith. Children watched their parents give away everything they owned in preparation for a rapture that never came. The psychological trauma was profound and lasting, with many never recovering from the shame and disillusionment. Synanon's transformation from a celebrated rehabilitation center to a violent criminal organization illustrates how institutional corruption can occur gradually, almost imperceptibly, until what was once beneficial becomes actively harmful. Chuck Dederich's early success in helping addicts recover gave him credibility that he would later exploit to justify increasingly extreme measures. The Synanon game, initially designed as therapeutic confrontation, became a tool for breaking down psychological resistance and enforcing absolute obedience. Former members describe how the line between treatment and torture became so blurred that they couldn't recognize their own victimization. The survivors of these groups share common experiences that reveal the profound psychological damage inflicted by cult involvement. Many struggle with what researchers call complex post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing not just the symptoms of traditional PTSD, but also difficulties with identity, relationships, and basic trust in their own judgment. Gabrielle Lavallee, who survived Thériault's torture, including the amputation of her arm, has spoken about the years of therapy required to rebuild her sense of self-worth and her ability to form healthy relationships. Her courage in escaping and testifying against Thériault likely saved other lives, but the cost to her own psychological well-being was enormous. Former Millerites faced a different but equally challenging recovery process. Beyond the immediate financial devastation, many struggled with what psychologists now recognize as spiritual trauma. Their entire worldview had been shattered, leaving them unable to trust religious authority or even their own spiritual experiences. Some abandoned faith entirely, while others spent years trying to rebuild a relationship with the divine that didn't depend on apocalyptic predictions or charismatic leaders. The ripple effects extended to their children and grandchildren, many of whom grew up with parents who had been so deeply wounded by religious manipulation that they couldn't provide spiritual guidance or stability. Synanon survivors describe a particularly insidious form of trauma because their abuse was disguised as treatment. Many entered the program genuinely seeking help for addiction and found themselves trapped in a system that exploited their vulnerability. The tough love philosophy made them doubt their own perceptions of abuse, convincing them that their discomfort was simply resistance to necessary healing. Some survivors report that it took decades to distinguish between legitimate therapeutic challenge and abusive manipulation, making it difficult for them to seek help for the very problems Synanon claimed to treat. The children who grew up in these environments face unique challenges that extend into their adult lives. Those raised in Thériault's commune witnessed and experienced unspeakable violence, often perpetrated by their own parents under coercion. Many struggle with attachment disorders, having learned early that the adults responsible for their protection could become instruments of harm without warning. The normalization of extreme violence and sexual abuse in their formative years created lasting patterns of hypervigilance and difficulty forming trusting relationships. Children of Millerite families, while spared physical violence, often grew up in households marked by profound disappointment and shame. Their parents' faith had been so publicly and dramatically shattered that normal religious observance became impossible. Many report feeling spiritually homeless, unable to embrace faith communities due to their family's traumatic history with religious authority, yet also unable to fully reject spirituality due to its central role in their early development. Synanon children faced the particular challenge of having their family structures deliberately destroyed as part of the organization's evolution. The forced divorces and partner swapping mandated by Deadliest meant that children lost stable parental relationships just as they were losing their connections to the outside world. Many describe feeling like possessions of the community rather than individuals with their own needs and rights. The broader social implications of these groups reveal troubling patterns in how society responds to cult activity. In each case, warning signs were ignored or dismissed for years before authorities intervened. Thériault's abuse was known to neighbors and some officials, but was dismissed as a private matter or alternative lifestyle. The Millerite movement was largely seen as harmless religious enthusiasm until the social disruption became impossible to ignore. Synanon maintained respectability and even government funding long after reports of abuse began surfacing, protected by its reputation and the reluctance of authorities to interfere with what appeared to be a successful treatment program. This societal complicity reflects deeper cultural blind spots about religious freedom, therapeutic authority, and individual autonomy. The same principles that protect legitimate religious practice and innovative treatment approaches can also shield abusive organizations from scrutiny. The challenge lies in distinguishing between unconventional but harmless practices and genuinely dangerous manipulation without infringing on fundamental freedoms. Modern cult experts emphasize that the psychological techniques used by these historical groups remain remarkably consistent in contemporary manipulative organizations. The isolation tactics employed by Theriot mirror those used by modern human trafficking operations and abusive relationships. The apocalyptic urgency that drove Millerite behavior can be seen in various contemporary movements that use fear of imminent catastrophe to justify extreme measures. The therapeutic language that disguised Synanon's abuse appears in numerous modern programs that exploit the vulnerability of people seeking help for mental health or addiction issues. The digital age has created new opportunities for cult recruitment and control that would have amazed these historical figures. Online communities can provide the isolation once achieved only through physical relocation to remote communes. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that reinforce apocalyptic beliefs more effectively than any 19th century preacher. The anonymity of internet communication allows modern manipulators to test and refine their techniques on vulnerable individuals without the risk of immediate social consequences. Understanding these historical cases provides crucial insight into recognizing and preventing contemporary cult activity. The patterns of gradual escalation, the exploitation of universal human needs for belonging and purpose, and the systematic destruction of critical thinking skills remain consistent across different eras and contexts. By studying how these groups operated, we can better identify the warning signs in modern organizations and relationships. The stories of the Anthill Kids, Millerites, and Synanon ultimately serve as powerful testimonies to both human vulnerability and human resilience. They show how easily our deepest needs for meaning, healing, and community can be perverted into tools of control and abuse. Yet they also demonstrate the remarkable capacity of survivors to rebuild their lives, find their voices, and use their experiences to protect others from similar harm. The courage of individuals like Gabriel Lavallee, who risked everything to expose Theriot's crimes, reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find the strength to resist and ultimately overcome the most oppressive forms of control. These cautionary tales compel us to remain vigilant, not just against obvious predators, but against the subtle erosion of individual autonomy that characterizes all forms of cult manipulation. They challenge us to create communities that meet genuine human needs for belonging and purpose without demanding the surrender of critical thinking or personal freedom. Most importantly, they remind us that the price of protecting human dignity is constant awareness of how easily it can be undermined by those who would exploit our most fundamental hopes and fears for their own gain.